Hello, this is Ashutosh Varshney speaking to you again from Boston. In my last column for ThePrint, I had argued that Trump's actions have attacked, willingly or unwittingly, the very core of India's post-Cold War foreign policy. My claim was that the core consisted of relationships with the United States, China, Pakistan, and Russia. And Trump's actions had serious implications for all of these. And a restructuring was absolutely necessary. That restructuring may have begun with Prime Minister Modi's trip to China recently and his meetings with Xi Jinping and President Putin. So my new column is about the implications for India's relationship with China now. But let me first begin with a proviso about the continuing significance of the United States. We cannot snap our ties completely with the United States, at least for one reason, though there many more reasons can be given. The US is still the largest economy in the world. At the end of 2024, last year, according to the IMF and the World Bank, America's GDP was $29.2 trillion, which amounted to roughly 26.2% of the world economy. The world's GDP was $111.3 trillion. A market of that size or an economy of that size simply cannot be shunned or ignored. And one has to explore possibilities there despite the impediments. But there's no doubt that Trump's radical break from America's post-Cold War foreign policy, especially his use of tariffs as a political and economic tool, is creating new geopolitical and geoeconomic scenarios. Trump is, of course, known to be mercurial, and abrupt changes in policy cannot be ruled out. But three things, I think, are likely to remain constant: use of tariffs in economic policy and also in politics, opposition to immigration, and smaller American investments in international security. The changes in these three realms are likely to be of degree, not likely to be fundamentally altered. So how should India imagine its way forward? Let me suggest that China may or will be even more central to Indian foreign policy now than it's been for recent years. But how India pursues its interests vis-a-vis China will remain a complex task. The first complication right away is that India will approach China, and that has already begun, from a position of considerable weakness. When the United States thought of India as a bulwark against China, at least in the Indo-Pacific region, the American support for India enhanced India's power. If we now assume that United States is no longer interested in balancing power in the Indo-Pacific, then India will have to deal with China as a singular entity, not as a US-supported power. Nonetheless, it is in India's interest to cultivate China. China is indisputably the second superpower in the world today, combining both economic and strategic might. India could have been somewhat of an equal to China if its economy had grown at 8 to 9% annually over the last 3 decades or so. India's economy, of course, took off after 1991, but it never touched Chinese levels. It was always the second or third highest, rarely the first. As a result, the situation now is as follows. A great deal has been made out of the fact that, especially in government cycles, this is true, that India is the world's fourth largest economy. But that says nothing. That statement, fourth largest economy, says nothing about the gap that has opened up between India and China. At the end of 2024, last year, and we have data from IMF and the World Bank on this, India's GDP was $3.9 trillion, and it has passed the 4 trillion mark in more recent months. While that was certainly higher than the GDP of the United Kingdom, for example, 3.6 trillion, or France, for example, 3.2 trillion, but it was only roughly a fifth of China's GDP, which was $18.7 trillion. I repeat, even though India had raced ahead of the United Kingdom and France in the overall size of the economy, it was only roughly a fifth of China's GDP, which is second only to the United States today. This has serious implications for India. Nearly 65 to 70% of India's exports to the US, amounting to $60 billion or so, after Trump's tariffs have lost their American buyers and markets. A market diversification strategy, therefore, is inevitable. And to look for opportunities in the second largest economy of the world would be only rational. It would be in our interest. China, at this point, enjoys a huge trade surplus vis-a-vis India, over $90 billion. With American markets heavily truncated, India will have to try to cut that deficit by exploring opportunities in Chinese markets. Trump's policies will have another terrible economic effect, which has not been talked about much yet. And for that also, India will have to find alternatives, non-American alternatives. American tariffs on Indian exports will dampen potential US investments in India. The basic assumption of the China plus one strategy of the last few years was as follows. To escape rising US China tensions, American investors would gradually, not instantly, that's not possible, would gradually move out of China and invest in India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, etc. One of the biggest US companies, Apple, mainly chose India, while many others chose Vietnam principally. Apple's exports from India, especially iPhones, have managed to escape US tariffs for now. But other investors may not be so lucky. So, those American investors not investing in services, but in merchandise trade, um, and hoping to use India to export to the United States are not likely to come in now unless Indo-US relationship, economic relationship significantly improves. China can fill potentially this investment gap. It is no longer simply a specialist in labor intensive production, clothes, apparel, footwear, toys. So it's not just that it will flood Indian markets with cheaper Ganeshas and cheaper Lakshmis. It is a scaling new heights in technologically advanced sectors artificial intelligence, telecoms, robotics, electric cars, aerospace, maritime engineering, wind and solar energy. Some of these sectors or investment from some of these sectors into India could be very helpful to India. There's only one other non-US market which matches China's market. If European Union, EU, is viewed as a single economic unit, which many people are willing to visualize EU as, then the GDP of EU is $19.4 trillion. In principle, therefore, the search for non-American alternatives should lead to exploration of opportunities in China as well as European Union. If India can strike a trade deal with EU on which it's been working for quite a long time, that will be very beneficial. But even with the EU option around, China will have to be a significant part, a very significant part of India's economic policy. There is, however, an important catch, a very important catch in here. Unlike the United States, India has a difficult security relationship with China. And that's true in two very important senses. China is the greatest weapons supplier of Pakistan, and some of that technology was used by Pakistan, especially in air warfare, vis-a-vis India in the recent conflict. And China also has an unresolved border dispute with India. How will the security logic be affected by the likely economic logic of the relationship? This will be the greatest challenge of India's new China policy. I'll speak to you in 2 weeks. Bye for now.